Chapter 1712. Shahu laughed and waved his hand. There's no need for you all to act. None of you have shadowed heaven pills to temper your body, so you trying to help will only be courting death. This time, just Yankai and I will go. The rest of you can just hide and watch the show from a distance. Sect Master Yang. Pang Zhen raised his brow in suspicion and asked quietly, Sect Master Yang is indeed a dragon among men. Disciple has exchanged blows with him once and was truly not his opponent, but he also just arrived on Shadowed Soul Island, so how will he be able to help Martial Uncle? Pang Zhen was well aware of Yankai's strength, but this was Shadowed Soul Island, not the limitless ocean. From his and Chien Mo's experiences, it was obvious that even if a cultivator was powerful in the outside world, they may not be strong here. As long as they were faced with a cultivator who had lived for some years on Shadowed Soul Island, anyone from the outside would easily be suppressed. So, when Shahu said that he would only take Yankai with him, Pang Zhen was a little worried. Shahu only flashed a wry smile and said, What do you know? Even this old master is not his opponent here, so how could he not be of help? Pang Zhen's jaw dropped, and his face filled with shock, almost suspecting that he had heard wrong. Glancing back at Yankai, who was standing at the stern of the boat, Pang Zhen found the former just smiling harmlessly back at him, completely relaxed and carefree. There's no need to doubt, that boy is indeed stronger than this old master. I exchanged blows with him 1 month ago and was repelled by a single palm. Now, Shahu did not continue, but Pang Zhen understood his meaning. Since Shahu had been beaten back by Yankai a month ago with a single palm, it was obvious that the gap between them was even wider now. Pang Zhen only became more shocked. All of them had been sucked into Shadowed Soul Island together, but after 2 or 3 months, Pang Zhen and the others with him had not seen any noticeable increase in their strength. Instead, they were pushed around like menial workers by the cultivators of Shadowed Soul Island. On the other hand, Yankai could defeat Pang Zhen's martial uncle Shah, who had lived here for 300 years. Was this boy a monster? The boat was not big, but it sailed quite smoothly across the sea. The little dolphin also swam up to and around it a few times, not moving any slower at all. 5 days later, Shadowed Soul Island came into view in the distance. All of you wait here. When this old master is finished with his business, he will come pick you up. Shahu gave Pang Zhen's orders before tossing him a bottle of Shadowed Heaven pills and saying, 1 pill per person, refine them carefully. Pang Zhen accepted gleefully. Since coming to Shadowed Soul Island, he had been coveting these Shadowed Heaven pills. He knew that the cultivators here had more intrepid physiques because of these pills, but unfortunately, he had no way to acquire any. They had to first officially join Shadowed Soul Island before they were eligible to receive some Shadowed Heaven pills from the Island Master after performing certain tasks. This entire process was quite long and dangerous, with perhaps up to 80% of people dying for some reason along the way. Even if they did receive some pills, the quantity would be small and the quality would be very low. But now, Shahu had tossed him a bottle filled with such pills. Pang Zhen thanked him respectfully and without delay opened the cap and distributed the pills to the disciples of Seed Temple. Chien Mo's eyes flashed when she saw this scene as a complicated mix of jealousy and helplessness filled her. Suddenly though, out of the corner of her eyes, she noticed something flying towards her, stretched out her hand, and caught it. Looking over, she saw Yankai smile at her and say, There's one inside for each of you as well. Chien Mo blinked once before snorting coldly, This general will repay this favor in the future. We can talk about it later. Yankai grinned before following Shahu towards Shadowed Soul Island. The little dolphin let out a long cry from the rear, seemingly telling Yankai to be careful. Giving Chien Mo a bottle of Shadowed Heaven pills was not just a whim for Yankai, but rather because he knew he would have to regardless. The little dolphin would obviously ask him for such a favor considering how close her relationship with Chien Mo was. On top of that, the Shadowed Heaven Lotus in Yankai's possession were almost all found thanks to the little dolphin's help. So it was not an exaggeration to say that at least half of the Shadowed Heaven Lotus and in turn, half of the Shadowed Heaven pills belonged to her. A bottle of Shadowed Heaven pills for Yankai was nothing. Shahu had slowed his pace, obviously waiting for Yankai to catch up. After Yankai arrived at his side, Shahu's face became solemn as he said, "Yan Kai, the purpose of this old master's trip today is only to kill that bastard Mingyu. On Shadowed Soul Island, Mingyu is the strongest, but there are a few others who are not weak as well. When the time comes, I hope you can deal with them so they don't interfere in this old master's battle." "No problem," Yan Kai readily agreed before asking, "How certain is old Sha that he can defeat that Mingyu?" Shahu's expression turned serious and he thought about it for a while before declaring, "At least 60%. Although this old master has not seen Mingyu for 100 years, his strength has certainly increased, but with those inferior Shadowed Heaven pills, no matter how much his strength has grown, it can't have been by much. This old master is confident he can emerge victorious in the end. Then I wish old Sha a swift and decisive victory." Yan Kai smiled. Shahu was in high spirits. Since taking the Shadowed Heaven pills refined by Yan Kai, his strength that had stagnated for nearly 100 years had been steadily increasing, and although not as exaggerated as Yan Kai's, this rate of growth was already extremely tyrannical compared to others. Compared with the Shadowed Heaven pills refined by Yan Kai, Shahu completely felt the Shadowed Heaven pills he used before were simply garbage. Not only was their quality extremely low, making them difficult to refine, the benefits to one's physique were meager. What's more, taking those inferior pills came with many hidden dangers, and while these could be ignored in the short term, after taking such Shadowed Heaven pills for an extended time, it would definitely cause problems for one's body. Since Mingyu no longer had an advantage when it came to Shadowed Heaven pills, Shahu no longer put him in his eyes. The speed of the pair was extremely fast, and it was not long before they landed on Shadowed Soul Island. Looking up at the city in the center of the island, Shahu sneered and accelerated, leaving behind only an afterimage where he once stood. Yan Kai followed unhurriedly, not falling behind Shahu by far. Spectre City was the only city on Shadowed Soul Island. There were about 10,000 cultivators in the city. It was not known when this city had been founded, but its walls were covered with ancient carvings, showing the weathering of time. Almost every cultivator who had the misfortune of coming to Shadowed Soul Island would eventually live in this city. In Spectre City, the one with the highest status was undoubtedly Shadowed Soul Island's Island Master Mingyu, followed by his henchman, who oversaw Shadowed Soul Island's day-to-day operations as well as the flow of Shadowed Heaven pill. The cultivators who lived on Shadowed Soul Island had to submit to Mingyu's rule if they wanted to obtain Shadowed Heaven pills. At the gate of the city, 5 cultivators wearing armor were monitoring the people who were entering and leaving. Any cultivator returning from the sea would have to hand over half of their spoils before they were allowed to pass. As for the most precious Shadowed Heaven Lotus, all of them had to be handed over. Any cultivator who dared try to keep Shadowed Heaven Lotus for themselves would receive extremely harsh punishment. A line of exhausted cultivators who had just returned from the ocean lined up outside the gates, preparing to enter Spectre City. Many of these cultivators had injuries, and some were even lacking arms or legs, looking quite disheveled. Obviously, these people were attacked by sea beasts when they went out and had suffered no small losses. Just as the armored cultivators were checking the harvest of these cultivators waiting to enter the city, they suddenly heard a loud ruckus coming from the crowd. The lead guard frowned and was about to scold the people, but seemingly sensing something as well, he turned his head to look into the distance. From afar, 2 human figures were approaching Spectre City as fast as lightning. Both figures left behind a long trail of after images, and only after moving 1,000 meters did these after images gradually disappear. The lead guard was shocked and quickly signaled to the rest of his companions to prepare themselves. Taking out their artifacts one after another, these guards quickly blocked the entrance to the city gate. When the 2 figures were only a few hundred meters away, the lead guard shouted, "Who goes there? Stop at once!" Scram! An angry shout came in response as the 2 figures rushed through the city gate and into Spectre City. The cultivators who were waiting in line to enter the city instantly went into an uproar, all showing looks of surprise. Order was strictly enforced on Shadowed Soul Island, and there had not been a forced entry like this in many years, but today, they had witnessed such a scene with their own eyes. Many people could not help but pay silent tribute to the two who had forcibly entered the city. Everyone felt that these two were as good as dead, and since they had provoked Mingyu's authority in Spectre City, their deaths would surely be miserable. However, before they finished their thoughts, the crowd heard a thunderous explosion and quickly turned their heads just in time to witness the lead guard explode into a cloud of blood mist, what remained of his armor and flesh scattering over a wide area. The onlookers felt a chill from head to toe and all fell silent. None of them even noticed when the lead guard had been attacked. At the same time, a roar that seemed to reach the heavens suddenly echoed from the city. "Mingyu, get out here and face this old master." This roar was earth-shattering and deafening, and many people could not help turning pale when they heard it. However, there were also many whose only fear was that the world was not chaotic enough, and after a moment, their expressions became excited as they moved closer to the source of the sound. These people wanted to find out just who this reckless fellow was that dared to call Mingyu directly by his name in Spectre City. The whole of Spectre City boiled up as many cultivators rushed towards Shahu's location, attracted by his booming challenge. Quickly, more than 2,000 people had gathered around, and the number was still increasing. Shahu stood quietly on the main street of Spectre City, his hands folded behind his back, his expression indifferent. Yankai stood one step behind him, wearing an aloof expression as he scanned the surrounding environment. Spectre City looked fairly tidy, and although it was a little shabby, it was still a great achievement to be able to build a stronghold in this forsaken place. There were even some shops lining the street buying and selling daily necessities. However, at this moment, the people in the nearby shops had long ago closed up and left, as none of them dared to remain nearby after Shahu let out his astonishing roar. There were many whispering voices among the crowd as they pointed towards Yankai and Shahu, some taking pleasure in their misfortune, some looking forward to the show, others glaring coldly while still others looked on indifferently. A myriad of emotions entangling in this small square. Horizontal ellipsis, Chapter 1713. Old fool, you dare offend the majesty of Sir Island Master? Surrender your life. From a distance, an angry shout rang out and a figure radiating a threatening aura rushed out from the end of the street, obviously looking to take credit for dealing with this matter. The management of Shadowed Soul Island was extremely strict, and there was seldom any kind of trouble, so the cultivators who followed Mingyu rarely had an opportunity to express their loyalty. Today was undoubtedly a good opportunity for these people to earn some favor by putting Shahu down. If they could please Mingyu, a bottle of good Shadowed Heaven pills was not impossible to obtain. So, after hearing Shahu's roar, this man rushed over immediately. As this man raced up the street, a large saber artifact appeared in his hand, and accompanied by his fierce aura and burly body, he gave off the appearance of a man who would kill without mercy. Shahu simply stood quietly on the spot, looking towards the tallest building in the center of the island. There seemed to be a shadowy gaze coming from that direction, paying attention from a distance, meeting Shahu's glare head-on, causing invisible sparks to fly and making the nearby crowd shiver slightly, as if the temperature on Shadowed Soul Island had suddenly dropped. The burly man with his saber did not seem to realize the change in atmosphere though, and rushed over to a spot just 10 meters from Shahu before jumping high and slashing out with his artifact, a sneer forming on his lips as he shouted, "Old dog, I'll be accepting your head." Shahu turned his head slowly as he finally glanced at the man who was approaching. Facing this gaze, the brawny man could not help sucking in a cold breath as a look of incomparable horror appeared on his face. His fierce aura melted away like snowflakes under the scorching sun, and the words he was about to shout caught in his throat. Freezing in place, the brawny man forced himself back down to the ground as he stared at Shahu with a pair of disbelieving eyes, his voice trembling as he hesitantly asked, "Shah, Island Master Shah?" This brawny man obviously recognized Shahu. Shahu sneered coldly, "Zhouan, I've not seen you in 100 years, but it seems you haven't made much progress." The brawny man named Zhouan glared at Shahu and immediately retorted, "Whether this show has made progress or not is none of your business. How come you are still alive? Former Island Master Shah, did Mingyu tell you I died?" Shahu sneered slightly as he stared at Joan as if he were an idiot. You believe that nonsense? Not only is this old master not dead, but he's also been living quite well. Today I've come to take Mingyu's head to relieve the hatred in my heart. Joan's expression fluctuated, and although he was clearly frightened, he still stood his ground. Shahu, you'd best stop dreaming. Island Master Mingyu's strength has grown greatly over the past 100 years. You were not his opponent back then, so you certainly aren't his opponent today. Obediently surrender without a fight and follow this Zhou to see the Island Master, and perhaps you can survive a catastrophe. Otherwise, since Island Master could defeat you 100 years ago, he can do so again today, Zhou declared loudly. Shahu burst into laughter. Idiot. Didn't Mingyu tell you that the reason he was able to defeat this old master back then was because he used poison? Since this old master has returned today, the traitor will definitely not have another chance to pull such a wicked stunt. Shahu no longer paid any attention to Zhou and instead turned his eyes back to the tall central building and shouted, Mingyu, if you don't have the guts to come down and fight this old master, then this old master will come to you. Saying so, Shahu bent his knees and then launched himself several hundred meters up into the air, soaring towards the center of the island like a great pang spreading its wings. Wishful thinking. Loud shouts rang out from all around as at least a dozen cultivators releasing blood-red auras sprang from the crowd to intercept Shahu. The bright red light pulsing from their bodies were signs of their astonishing vitality. The stronger the light, the stronger their bodies. The Shadowed Soul Island cultivators that Yankai had encountered before were too weak to release such light, so he had never seen such a display before. However, after learning the true identity of Shahu, a dozen or so Shadowed Soul Island masters could no longer hide and shot out with their full strength. Shahu, however, ignored these approaching cultivators and continued to stare coldly towards the front, without sorrow or joy, without fear or panic, simply releasing a thick, undisguised killing intent. The dozen or so people looked overjoyed as all of them desperately pushed the power in their bodies to use their best moves to attack. But before any of them could execute their strikes, a young man appeared strangely behind Shahu, floating quietly in the air as if he was flying. Facing the fierce attack of a dozen people, the young man still smiled calmly and relaxedly, only casually sending out his fists the instant before the incoming attacks reached him. Fist shadows poured out like raindrops in a great storm, blasting out in all directions. All of the figures suddenly had the red light pulsing from their bodies explode and were sent flying as they cried out in pain. Several of them even exploded mid-air into clouds of blood fog. Hong hong hong. The survivors all smashed into the nearby buildings, leaving giant impact craters that their blood flooded out into. Their bodies mangled. Each of these attacks now had faint auras which seemed to teeter on the brink of being extinguished. The thousands of onlookers all went into an uproar as they stared at the young man who was still suspended in mid-air in horror, their eyes flashing with shock and terror. The dozen or so people who attacked Shahu just now were all masters with famous names on Shadowed Soul Island. No one knew how strong these people were in the outside world, but on Shadowed Soul Island, every one of them would rank amongst the top 100 masters. These people were all loyal subordinates of Mingyu. However, after just one round of attacks by this young man, these dozen or so people were either dead or disabled, none of them able to get up. It was nothing less than an utter rout. Who was this young man? Why had they never seen or heard of him before? Compared with this young man, Shahu's name was already known to many people. On Shadowed Soul Island, it was not just Joan who recognized Shahu. Among the onlookers, many recalled Island Master Sha from 100 years ago. One told 10, 10 told 100, and soon, every cultivator on Shadowed Soul Island knew what this situation was all about. It turned out that the former Island Master had come to seek revenge against the current Island Master. This was a once-in-a-lifetime drama that no one wanted to miss. However, after the young man in front of them displayed his overwhelming might, none dared to chase after Shahu to spectate the excitement. Those cultivators who took orders from Mingyu did not dare to move in the slightest. Still hearing the miserable cries from their comrades, as long as these people didn't have a death wish, they knew better than to annoy Yankai. Yankai glanced around and said with a smile, "Old Sha is going to challenge Mingyu now. You may all spectate from a distance, but if anyone dares try to interfere, don't blame this Yang for being merciless." In normal times, an unknown young man speaking such words would be ignored by all, but after seeing him repel the combined force of a dozen masters so easily, Yankai's words held absolute authority. No one dared to challenge him, and all the cultivators who had come to watch the show contented themselves to watching from afar, all of them wondering who was stronger, the former island master or the current island master. At the center of the island, a great battle had clearly erupted, and Shahu's ferocity was clearly being transmitted to everyone present. Even a dozen kilometers apart, the force behind each collision could be felt as thunderous booms echoed across the sky, thrilling and terrifying the crowd. Yankai stood in place for a moment, then suddenly drew a line in the dirt, clearly marking the point which no one was to pass, then turned around and walked towards the battlefield without looking back. Even after he left, no one dared to cross this mark and could only spectate this earth-shattering battle from a distance. Although all of them were feeling quite anxious, they could only endure patiently. Yankai crossed a dozen kilometers in just a few breaths to arrive at the battlefield. At the base of the tallest building in the center of the island, a few bloody corpses were strewn about, apparently killed by Shahu. Some cultivators stood not far away, glancing back and forth between the battlefield and Yankai. None of them dared to intervene at will. When Shahu first arrived here, he instantly killed a few people to set up his prestige. After witnessing such a display, these people did not dare challenge Shahu. Today, only Mingyu could fight Shahu. Yankai did not pay attention to the masters who were spectating the battle and instead cast his eyes towards Mingyu. What Yankai saw was a neatly dressed middle-aged man with a scholarly aura, similar to Great Elder Mo Yu of Clear Sky Sex. However, his physical strength was countless times stronger than Mo Yu. The red light pulsing from Mingyu's body was extremely thick, showing how tyrannical his body was. Every time he threw a punch or sent out a kick, the wind would roar as if the world was being split apart. Shahu's strength was not inferior though, and by the time Yankai arrived, the two men had already exchanged hundreds of blows, leaving behind huge pits in the ground and smashing many of the surrounding buildings. Even the majestic central tower had a wall missing and was currently leaning unstably. Yankai observed for a moment and could not help raising his brow. Shahu regarded Mingyu as his greatest enemy, and every time he mentioned Mingyu in the past, his hatred and rage were clear, which was not unreasonable. Yankai was also certain that 3 months ago, Shahu was definitely not Mingyu's opponent. Judging from the strength Shahu displayed when he first met him at the time, he could not have lasted more than 100 breaths against the current Mingyu. However, Shahu had taken a lot of the Shadowed Heaven pills that Yankai had refined over the past 3 months and achieved great progress in his physical strength, allowing him to now compete with Mingyu on even terms. The fight between these two was savage, almost to the point of trading wounds with each other. This style of fighting was most suitable for cultivators with strong physiques, because with their rich vitality, injuries suffered in this kind of battle would be easy to restore. Yankai had used this style of combat to kill powerful enemies more than once. However, when the physical strength of two enemies was equal, this brutal style of fighting instead became a contest of endurance. Only the one who could last longer and inflict greater damage would win out in the end. At this point, Shahu seemed to occupy the advantage.